Welcome, everyone. My name is Colleen Vincent. I am the VP of Community for the James Beard Foundation, and I want to welcome you all to our industry support webinar, Build Back Better, Sustainability and the Viability of Local Agriculture. In a sprawling and not always so United States, local practices and foodways are indispensable for not only sustainability, but also resiliency, particularly in the era of COVID-19. For this panel, we'll shine a light on some ways to preserve important local community foodways, including some that are under imminent threat of disappearing forever. But first, we'll go to housekeeping. So this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available after the program wraps. We'll save questions for the end as time allows, but please feel free to write your questions at any time using the webinar toolbar. If you're having technical difficulties, please message us using the webinar toolbar and we'll do what we can to troubleshoot. And now I am pleased to introduce today's panelists. First panelist is fisherperson Melanie Brown of Salmon State, Bristol Bay, Alaska. She and her family and her ancestors have been sustained by the Nanook River in Bristol Bay prior to the onset of commercial fishery. And now her children are the 5th generation of fishermen since her great-grandfather, Paul Chacon. He was one of the first indigenous people of Bristol Bay to fish a company sailboat. The proposed Pebble Mine, which Melanie will talk more about as we open up the conversation, awoke in her the need to do what she could to conserve the world's last wild salmon habitat and runs. And so Salmon State has provided this opportunity, and I'm really excited actually to hear from her. Our next guest is David S. Shields, Carolina Distinguished Professor in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina. As the chairman of the Carolina Gold Rice Foundation, he has been instrumental in the recovery and restoration of many key ingredients to Southern cooking, such as Carolina gold rice, bene, purple ribbon sugarcane, purple straw wheat, seashore black rye, sea island wild flint corn, the rice pea, the dye house cherry, and the Carolina African runner peanut. He also chairs Slow Foods Arc of Taste Biodiversity Committee for the South. He is the Southern Foodways Alliance Keeper of the Flame and the Slow Food USA Snail Blazer of Biodiversity. He also was a 2018 finalist for the James Beard Book Award and Food Scholarship. He's a historian of agriculture and food preparation and published Southern Provisions on the creation and revival of a cuisine and the culinarians' lives and careers from the first age of American fine dining. Our next guest, Jermaine Jenkins, is the co-founder and chief farm officer at Fresh Future Farm in North Charleston, South Carolina. She earned a certification in commercial urban agriculture from Growing Power, Inc. in 2014, and in that same year won the inaugural Feeding Innovation Competition sponsored by the South Carolina Community Loan Fund and Seed Capital to start an urban farm and grocery store in the middle of a residential neighborhood. Fresh Future Farm has sold and distributed over 16 tons of basic and specialty groceries, hosted over 200 North Charleston students for STEAM farm camps, and has trained over 100 adults in natural gardening practices. Although the pandemic forced the closure of the on-site sliding scale grocery store, the team continues to offer biweekly grocery distributions to the surrounding community and is a fiscal sponsor for the Low Country Mutual Aid Fund, which helps support rent and utility needs of marginalized BIPOC and LGBTQ+ people. And last but certainly not least, we have Chef Ian Boden of The Shack in Stouton, Virginia. He has received critical acclaim from publications as wide-ranging as the Wall Street Journal to Garden and Gun. After climbing the ranks in New York City, he relocated back to his home in Virginia at the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in the Shenandoah Valley to create a cuisine that is both forward-thinking and yet respectful of the past. He was awarded Star Chef's Rising Star for DC and is a 2-time semifinalist for Best Chef Mid-Atlantic for the James Beard Awards. Currently, he and his wife are working on opening a Southern and Mid-Atlantic goods store named the Stouton Grocery, where they will showcase products and goods made throughout the region. And so I am pleased to welcome our guests to this topic. And so first things first, I've said a lot about each of you, but in your own words, if you could just give us kind of a brief summary of what you do and then kind of work into your role in your communities, your particular role in your community's food system. So Melanie, we'll start with you.
Okay. Chamai and Kuyana Colleen. My Yupik name is Taikupa, and I am talking to you from Tlingit on the lands of the Akwan and the Takuquan Tlingit. My people are originally from Bristol Bay, but now I reside in Southeast Alaska in the place that is known as Juneau. And to get to your question, finally, so it's interesting, that I'm part of an agricultural conversation, even though I fish, but also, our job codes are they're all sorted together in NAICS. And so the upfront work is not in growing the salmon. I go and I catch the salmon, and I'm a owner operator of a small fish business in Bristol Bay out of the community of Naknek, where my mother is from, my mother, Catherine Shukan Brown. And my father became a fisherman when he met my mother. And now my children participate in the fishery with me. We fish out of a small boat. It's a 22-foot skiff. It's an open skiff, and we fish 300 feet of gillnet gear. And we our target fish are wild sockeye salmon. They require, as I mentioned before, they require no upfront investment. All the work is in bringing the fish in and delivering it. To me, it's a perfect protein. I'm involved in every step of the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you very much. Germaine?
Uh-oh.
We got you. We'll get you. Hold on, Germaine. Oops. Unmute. Okay, great. We got you.
Well, thank y'all so much for having me today. And what we do, or what we did with Fresh Future Farm, is we transformed a vacant lot into an urban farm that has a USDA grocery store on site. We provide training about agricultural strategies to mitigate the impact of rising sea tides. And our farm is one of the few places in farming spaces that does not flood during hurricanes or snowstorms that are random. We support a vertically integrated Black food system that addresses the disparities that Black chefs, farmer, and value-added producers experience. We educate consumers and students about basic nutrition that's culturally relevant, and produced a cookbook to support that effort. And we are just talking about the cultural relevance of what West African enslaved people brought to agriculture, and then what the Gullah Geechee people were able to do. And also, we're teaching a class about Black food justice pioneers today, for folks to know that there is a place for them. Especially in a space that experiences food apartheid, there's a place for them to participate and create solutions.
Thank you, Germaine. And I will get back to some of those elements after we make the round. So Chef Boden, if you would talk a little bit more about what you do and your role in your community's food system.
Yeah, sure. So we have a 26-seat restaurant in Staunton, Virginia. It was kind of an homage. It started as an homage to my wife's family, who grew up and is all from this region, right in the foothills of Appalachian, which I had zero connection to. I was called a carpetbagger quite a bit when I first moved to the area. But I did grow up in Virginia. It's just Northern Virginia, so people don't really consider that the South so much. So this restaurant was built basically to pay homage to Grandma Tizzy, my wife's maternal grandmother. Currently, we're working on opening the Staunton Grocery, which was actually the name of the first restaurant that I opened in Staunton that I failed miserably at because I was way too young and way too high on myself to listen to anything that anybody else had to say. So I shut that down and I worked at several other restaurants. And then now that the Shack is going well and we find ourselves in the predicament that we're in financially, the smartest thing in the world to do is go ahead and spend all your savings on opening a second business and hope that it'll help you get through this pandemic. So the idea behind the Staunton Grocery is really to become much more inclusive in our community, making sure that our local community has some kind of contact with the producers, farmers, makers that we've been working with forever. We're really trying to introduce our local community to not just the products, but the people that raise and make our foods, and some of our crafts that are included in how we prepare food. So we have friends that make handmade pans and knives and things like that will also feature at the store. The idea is also to have it much more of like a community center type of place where we're going to have tastings, educational seminars, friends who write books, have them come through and talk about what they do in their communities. Really just trying to tie everybody back together and strengthen our community in these crazy, crazy times. So.
Thank you, Chef. David, if you could talk a little bit more about what you do, which is a lot, and your role in your community's food system. And I know your role your community is broader, a regional size, as opposed to, several blocks. So if you could talk a little bit more about the work that you do.
Well, the first thing that I think is important is that I am a professor at a public university, and I view myself as a servant of the citizens of the state who pay my salary. So I don't charge anything for the advice that I give. I supply seed to farmers and institutions free of charge. People regularly call upon me at any hour of the day or night with questions, and I try to answer them. And I think that's only right, since the people of South Carolina have paid for the privilege. What I do is try to understand the most important elements of our regional food, historically, culturally, and to find those portions of it that have been lost. As many of you know, plant breeding in the last 60 or so years has been greatly concerned with productivity, disease resistance, processability, eye appeal, and the things that have mattered most over the most centuries, that is nutrition and flavor, have been marginalized. So it's important to get the classic grains, fruits, and vegetables that were part of the growing system traditionally for every community in the South, to reconstitute them, to save the genetics for them. So I study what was lost. I try to find the seed. Back in 2006, the Carolina Gold Rice Foundation had a list of 45 ingredients that were the steady sellers in our region. All but 2 were functionally extinct. And in the subsequent years, we found all but 4. And those 4 that we've not found, 2 of them are strawberries. I don't expect ever to find them. But one, which is a white mammoth rye, the original rye whiskey rye of the South, I'm closing in on. It was last grown in 1990 in Canada. I know some wheat and rye breeder up there has got it stuffed away in a freezer somewhere. I've just got to find that person. When I get the seed, I put it into the hands of people who want it. And I work with all of the communities. Right now, I'm in a major cultigen rematriation project with the Lumbee in southern North Carolina, also the Wakamasuan and the Kohari peoples. We restored the Catawba's traditional flour corn, which had been lost over the course of the 20th century 2 years ago. I work a lot with the African diaspora plants, trying to get them into the hands of farmers who need them. Sometimes difficult to get good quality seed, but even working on it. And Germaine, I bet some of the things that you're growing in your garden, if they've come through BJ Dennis or something, may have been stuff that either me or someone in the network there handed over. So that gives you a sort of general idea.
Thank you, David. And no, to Melanie, you said earlier, I know you were talking about like everybody. There's a lot of people here involved in agriculture, and yes, you're involved in like, actual like meat without feet. But the reason that this panel is here is because there are benefits to investing in this kind of work, and they're not only personal, but they're also, they're also communal. And so you being a 4th generation fisherman and your children being a 5th generation fisherman, if you could talk about the way that this kind of investment of energy and time and labor that has existed for several generations, like what kinds of benefits does the community see as a result?
Well, I'd say, first of all, I'd like to mention the fact that, there is a good landing tax in the borough that Naknek falls in. So, of course, the community benefits economically by this landing tax. Just off the top of every delivery, I can't remember if it's 1 or 2%. I think it's 1% goes back into the community, to support public infrastructure. So that's a positive thing economically. But when it comes to, just looking at all of these small businesses in Bristol Bay that are supported by this fishery, that is this thriving fishery, that just returned over 50 million wild sockeye salmon this season. Huge numbers. So as a small business, I benefit in monetarily so that I can support my family, but I'm also able to fill my freezer and feed my family salmon in the winter. And for people who aren't invested in a small fishing business, where they can sell their fish, through the commercial market, they're still able to participate in the fishery through personal use and subsistence means, and just lay out a small net on the beach and bring in fish when they want. And for elders who who aren't able to continue to fish, the community is small enough that people will take care of them. They'll bring them fish. Bring them the first fish of the season, which is, so there's a community of sharing when it comes to these wild and natural foods that are available to us in Bristol Bay. And there's sort of a blending too of, of old traditions and, along with the commercial fishery. There are many people like me who are indigenous to the region. And they participate in their traditional foodways, but they also participate in the commercial fishery so that they can, have means to buy the things that they need. So I feel like it, it benefits people on a lot of levels.
It sounds like a whole ecosystem, because you have people on the water, people in the fishery, and then you have, the communal aspect, and so it employs people, feeds people, like culturally relevant foods, which Germaine, we will get to you in a second to kind of further that conversation. But it sounds like there's an opportunity there for everyone to be a part of this system, like economically and spiritually and physically. And so the salmon is just as much a part of the community as any one individual.
I agree with you. I like the way you put that.
Yeah. And so, Germaine, you talked about it before in your introduction, but if you could just expand on kind of the benefits of these kinds of investments that for you personally, but also what you see out there in the community. What are the benefits of investing so completely in the local system?
Well, there are numerous benefits, and personally for me, Fresh Future Farm is 5 minutes from where I live, and like at least when they started, all of our employees could say the same thing, but it's impactful on a personal level because I'm making a difference where I live. Because there are issues around housing quality, affordable housing, gentrification here, we are proud to pay a livable wage to those folks who work with us. And like I came to Charleston from the PD area to go to culinary school. So what we've been able to do through Fresh Future Farm is create the workspace that I needed when I was a single mom finishing my culinary degree. On the community level, I believe that we are serving as a model to other underserved BIPOC communities as a solution to what we call food apartheid, where there is access without control. And this is an affordable solution, a culturally relevant solution. And because we operate a grocery store, and we are working class folks doing this work, it's more mutual aid than it is charity because our farm is nonprofit. And our hope is to be also an anchor in organizing amongst Black farmers and food producers in the state. And we do that through our annual conference and our bi-monthly coalition meetings that just started. But there has been a history of agriculture in this space, the Shakur Cherokee community that started with the Casaba Native Americans. And I'll talk some more about some other historical references with Black farmers in that space. But we hope to kind of get folks interested in farming as a career, and a career that benefits their neighbors. So that's us.
Thank you, Germaine. And Chef Bowden, it was funny because you're like, I'm from Northern Virginia, but I'm working in the part of the state that your wife comes from, and there's a perception of Appalachia, of same working class to like lower class persons, and my curiosity is, you as a chef who worked in New York City and then came to work in this this very specific region, like what are first of all the personal benefits, but how does the community benefit from this kind of investment?
So Staunton is kind of an anomaly. I mean, it's a fairly progressive town in a very poor county. So it's kind of interesting, the dichotomy between the county and the town itself. For me, it's always been a very big challenge. Once again, coming when I was as young as I was, and as full of myself as I was, I rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, not realizing myself, and then not realizing how much benefit we could bring to each other and how much benefit we could bring to the community. Some of that persists till this day, it's Can you rephrase the question for me a little bit? I'm having trouble getting into it. I'm sorry.
So you moved into this community. I know it's like chefs, they have a calling, they want to cook for other people. That part I get. But I'm asking what you perceive as like the community benefits of you participating in this system so very locally in the food system. in a
Right.
place
So, I
that's
mean,
like, yeah, go ahead.
so the farming community and our downtown community were pretty separated when I first got here. Our farmers market was underserving the community, and the community wasn't supporting the farmers market. So one of the big pushes that I feel that we helped develop is making more people aware of what was grown right in their backyards and starting to focus more on those local farmers and local producers. And obviously, the more money that we spend within our community is going to benefit our community as a whole. So it's been cool to see the change over a lot of young people from bigger markets have left those bigger markets to start small family farms in our region and kind of revitalizing the whole farmer community, which had really turned to monoculture in our community. There's lots of big cattle farms and fields and fields and fields of corn. And now you're looking at smaller family farms that are producing a more diverse crop, much more sustainably, and including the community in it by selling at the farmers market. And I think for our part in that, I think we've really helped push the farmers to try planting new crops. There's several farmers I sit down with every year, and we go through everything they've grown for us that previous year, and they want to ask what we want them to grow. And I always encourage them to grow what they grow best, and then put in one row of something new. Let's experiment a little bit, but I don't want them to have financial ruin because we try to get them to plant something that's just not going to work on their farm. Every farmer knows their land and knows what's going to grow best and what's going to be most productive for them. And I want to make sure that they're sustainable before we start trying to push the envelope and do different things. But it's also been good because when people eat at our restaurants, they try something new, and then they're going down to the farmer's market and they see it, and it's reinforced of who's grown it, and they've developed a taste for something new. So how we've contributed, I think.
Thank you. Now, David, I have a slightly different question because, as the resident historian here, I'd love for you to speak more about what are the benefits of these kinds of investments from that particular perspective. And I know you're out there like searching for and giving away seeds to people that want it, but how does the community benefit? And what are the precedents? Like, what are the precedents for these benefits?
Right. Well, let me talk about two communities first, and I'll talk about the community of farmers. It seems to me increasingly that commodity farming, the farming of soybeans and corn in the South, is becoming unsustainable. More and more large-scale monoculture commodity farmers are finding that, someone growing corn in the Ukraine can set the world price, and that price is lower than can sustain the farm. They're pawns in an international game. And so for the first time in a long time, there is an interest in seeing diversity in terms of their products that they produce. Small farmers have always had this, and family farms of many generations have tended to be much more diverse. But in the larger world of farming in South Carolina, they're interested in crops that have revenue possibilities. And there are several things that produce revenue. One is flavor. If you have something that tastes better than anything else, people are going to buy it. And of course, people like Ian, who has a professional tongue, can serve as the gateway to introducing people to those superior flavors. The other thing that sells is a story. And that's where history comes in. If you have something like the Sea Island red pea, one of the greatest of the gullah legumes that tastes splendid, but is also, the food of the ancestors. Flavor plus story is the very best thing that you can have going into the market.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate that. So, you know, upon that, and you know, I have a different question again for you around this, but you know, let's talk about some of the threats that you know your particular community food system is facing. I think that's really important, and then we can start talking about like how these things can be fortified. So, you know, Melanie, you know, I honestly started this, helped pull this together very specifically with you in mind. And so if you wouldn't mind talking about what's happening, what's threatening Bristol Bay salmon at the present moment.
Sure, I'll do my best. It's kind of a lot to cover. So I don't know if any of the viewers have the ability to maybe reference the Stop Pebble Mine Now website, or visit the Defend Bristol Bay website, and maybe look at that, or make a note to yourself to look at it later. But so Bristol Bay, it's in this nook of the map of Alaska, just inside of the Bering Sea, and it's perfect habitat that supports these amazingly big runs. The habitat is intact because there aren't any roads that lead to it. I'm glad you brought up genetic diversity, David. Even though you know you were talking about seeds and I'm talking about fish, the genetic diversity really lends itself to these amazing runs. You know, sometimes there are habitat areas that are not so productive in certain years, depending on different atmospheric conditions or whatever it is, but then other parts of the system will kind of go into high gear. And fish scientists are still trying to figure out that, but they call the genetic diversity, they refer to it as the portfolio effect. You know, all the genetic diversity really lends itself to recovery if there are certain parts of the system that collapse. And so if only we could just leave it untouched, it would just, you know, unless something else comes in, you know, like with you know, maybe climate change is the thing that'll end things in Bristol Bay for us. But right now we're trying to keep this massive mine out. Unfortunately, at the headwaters of the two most productive rivers in Bristol Bay, there is a huge deposit of ore. It's 11 billion tons of ore. And the target minerals are copper, gold, and molybdenum. And they're in very, very low concentration. So 11 billion tons of ore would have to be like torn out of the earth, and then, you know, pulverized to separate these target minerals, which don't even comprise 1% of the ore body. And then all of the waste rock and tailings will be left behind, and, you know, just torn up earth. And unfortunately, these minerals are housed in sulfide rock, which is acid generating. And in order for this massive deposit to be economically viable, the producers will have to leave the tailings behind an earthen tailings storage facility, an earthen dam. And I don't know how many of you know about the Mount Poly incident. There have been 3 tailings dam failures in Brazil in the past 5 years, I believe. And you know, when a tailings dam breaks, there's a lot of havoc that takes place. You know, there's so much velocity and volume of material that just everything in its wake, just, you know, it stands to tear up the ground even more. And these tailings dams are supposed to hold this waste back into perpetuity. And we don't anticipate that the mining company that wants to develop this deposit is going to stick around and manage their water treatment facility and the tailings storage facility into perpetuity. So it's not a matter of if the tailings dam is going to break, it's a matter of when. And myself and many others are doing everything we can to keep that from happening, to keep the mine from being built. And just the other day, another step in the federal permitting process was approved. The final environmental impact statement was filed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and we're anticipating that the record of decision is probably going to move forward because of the political climate that we're in. Unfortunately, it's politics that are driving this process instead of science. And if people were really looking hard at the science, I don't see how they could even begin to believe that it makes sense to build this mine, especially when it comes to how it could impact food security, not only for the community that I was talking about earlier, or the community of Naknek and the other communities in Bristol Bay, but you know, a lot of supply chains when it comes to salmon would be disrupted, and a lot of, I mean, Bristol Bay is such a huge fishery that we have countries as customers, not just this community food base that the salmon provide, and then the networks in the United States. But the salmon gets sent around the world to feed people. So I just don't understand why our leaders aren't prioritizing food security around this perfect protein that grows itself.
Thank you, Melanie. And with that, Germaine, I want to talk to you about some of the threats to your local food system, which you touched upon earlier, but if you could expand on some of those points, that would be really illuminating, actually.
Well, I think like most folks who are working in agriculture right now, climate change, is a factor. Where Fresh Future Farm is, we're located in the coastal plains, which means we're supposed to be able to grow year round. But last year, May was so hot that and we don't use irrigation intentionally because we know that water is a finite resource, and we want to get back to systems that don't require water. But last May, our blueberries turned into blueberry raisins on the vine. It got so hot. There have been times where we've gotten peaches on our trees in January because the weather was so mild during the winter. And lettuces is another example of a crop that you're supposed to plant in the fall here. And if we're fortunate, then the crop will last through the spring, but it's because the winters are so mild these days, lettuce is bolting in January and February. So what, we've tried to do is grow trees that don't care about the heat, like bananas. And we've also grown sugarcane to kind of create microclimates in our space so that we can mitigate some of that heat. Gentrification is another threat for us. We got a lease for the city to grow on this land, and we're, in the process where we hope to try to purchase it. But, as, the neighborhood gentrifies, the folks that we are there to serve, our neighbors, their future is not certain in that space. And then I guess, we, have a reliance on power structures that are not necessarily connected to the crisis, that, the folks that live in these neighborhoods are experiencing around food and environmental injustice. So, those are our biggest threats.
Thank you, Germaine. And Ian, what kind of threats do you see in your local region, your local community, from your chef perspective?
So for us, I think one of the biggest threats for us, other than obviously climate change, which you guys have touched on more than I can, the big thing that we see is the real cost of food and what real food costs to grow, and what it costs for us to put it up in a restaurant. I think through this whole pandemic, I think there's been a lot of education as far as that goes, and I think we're making some progress, but people still have no idea. And honestly, the big corporate restaurants are going to make it much harder on all of us to be able to be sustainable as businesses going forward, because they, excuse my language, they don't give a shit, and they're going to keep their prices low, and they're going to keep taking advantage of their staff, paying them as little as possible, and continue to charge nothing for their food, and continue to buy lots of commodity food. And we don't do that. Nor will we. I mean, we choose to pay a livable wage. Where we're trying to give health insurance to all of our staff. We try to buy everything we possibly can. If not, within 100 miles from us, we go regional. When we pay real money for it, and we take real time and care in preparing it, and that isn't cheap. It's just not. And so for socially for restaurants to do better, for us to pay our staffs better, guests have to understand what it actually costs. And so I think that's the biggest struggle that we have going forward, especially coming out of the pandemic. Yeah.
Thank you, Chef. And David, slightly, amendment to the question, because, we've kind of, you've touched upon some of the threats, and, I know most wholeheartedly you're invested in continued biodiversity. But are there comparative historical challenges or losses that we can kind of look to as maybe, some kind of framework for the future of agriculture and fish in this country?
There are certain things that we can examine. One of the major problems that we face is the monopolization of seed. Now, in terms of vegetables, that is not so terrible a thing, but grains are very difficult to secure seed for an heirloom grain, because they're open pollinated, and none of the major seed companies want to produce seed that they don't have proprietary control over, and they don't want farmers to save seed, particularly for something like grain. And so one of the things that we've had to do is form a foundation in order to make sure that there's enough rice seed or enough corn seed available. And you have to look to universities and other entities that can produce enough quality seed for the grains. Now, there have been periods, particularly in the Soviet Union, when the monopolization of seed led to problems in terms of limiting the diversity of things and causing disease outbreaks and famines. And the tendency, 80% of the world's seed market is controlled by 3 multinational corporations. And they just want their proprietary brands out there and get this genetic bottlenecking take place. So while you can get wonderful vegetables, you can get great fruit. The stuff that bread and beer is made of, corn, much more difficult to ensure that good quality, fine tasting, wholesome grain will be available in the future.
Now, David, I know, for chefs, this might be a little bit this might be obvious, but I must ask, why is it important? Why is biodiversity important? We've talked a little bit about monoculture, but there's a lot of certainly food waste in this country. But so why is biodiversity important as opposed to just, you know, monoculture and overfeed?
Well, think of it this way. I'll tell a story. Everyone grew the same watermelon in Georgia in the end of the 19th century. It was called Kolb's Gem watermelon. And they grew it because the people up in the northern markets liked big melons that could ship and not break up. And so you had entire counties in Georgia doing this one watermelon. No one wanted to grow anything else. But if you cover a countryside with just one thing, sooner or later, the pest or pathogen that loves that thing is going to show up. And when it shows up, it will find paradise. That's what happened in 1893 when Fusarium wilt showed up in a watermelon field in southern Georgia and wiped out a third of the watermelons within one season. And it spread and spread and spread. Genetic bottlenecking invites disease, it invites pestilential invasions. It's bad business. Now, the thinking is that if we just keep tweaking the genetics, we'll outrun the viruses, the diseases. So every year you have to have a new form of seed that everyone buys. And of course, it plays into the model of a monopoly vision seed company. But I hope that that gives you a clear idea of what's happening there.
Thank you, David. And Germaine, as a farmer, and listening to all of this, but also in your personal experience as a farmer, as a chef, what needs to be fortified? Like, how can we fortify things? How can we revive things? And what needs to be abandoned? I mean, I have some ideas about what needs to be abandoned, but I want to hear yours.
Well, I have to piggyback on what David's point, polycultures need to be fortified, because our most popular crops are our fruit, and we grow bananas, but we grow maybe 3 or 4 different varieties of bananas that do well in our particular climate. But we don't grow dwarf Cavendish, which is experiencing that same kind of there's I can't remember if it's a disease or a pest that's wiping out those crops. So we focus very much on biodiversity at the farm, and also because the space that we use right now is less than an acre. So, at one point we had 50 different or 50 fruit trees and bushes on the space, and we're trying to add to that, to create the microclimate so that we don't have to use irrigation in the summer. But the other thing that we think needs to be fortified is capacity on the municipal, state, and federal level that's monetary for Black farmers, because as you know, it's not just recent, but where Black farmers were 14% of the farming population, now it's less than 2%, and we're trying to work to get folks excited, like I said before, about growing food because it's needed. And in a state like South Carolina, where I guess it was 2013, there was a study done that showed that folks that lived in the state spent $11 billion on food, but only $1 billion was actually produced in the state. So there's a lot of economic opportunity to grow up some new farmers or replace aging farmers in this work with biodiversity in mind.
Thank you, Germaine. And so, my next question, and somebody kind of asked this, so I'm going to start with Melanie and then ask, a broader, but more specific version of this question to you, Ian. What can chefs and consumers do to support the work you do? Melanie.
Okay. Well, I think that Chef, I was going to say in terms of the revamping question, but it's definitely tied to this is, you know, we're working to shorten supply chains, and COVID has really done a lot to help people recognize like seafood is a really good protein. I want to seek out domestic seafood. And so it's been really good for direct marketers. And I'm just hoping to see more direct marketers helping to shorten supply chains and making more wild sockeye salmon available to American consumers. One place that I would direct consumers and chefs to is I would recommend that you look at the Bristol Bay Regional Seafood Development Association website, because they have a listing of their fishermen who are direct marketers. The organization that I work with when I'm doing my advocacy work, when it's not fishing season, is called Salmon State. And Salmon State has just launched, my colleague Elizabeth Herendine, who you know, Colleen, she just launched our salmon marketplace. And the entities or the small businesses listed in this marketplace, they went through a list of questions that Elizabeth developed that point toward a value system that is associated with these small fish businesses. Another thing that I think is really exciting, and it's just getting underway, and I'm really hoping that this is something that is going to continue to grow. A friend of mine, Ben Blakey, he has been working to build his small business, his small fish business called Northline Seafoods. And he's doing something very interesting with salmon. He is freezing them in the round. You know, he makes sure that they're, what you do is you pop one gill so that the fish can bleed. And because if any excess blood that's left in the fish, it will, it'll cause taint or like, or it will, will taint the taste of the fish. Potentially, there's more bruising that can take place, and any blood that is in the fish will, that enters the flesh will, it'll lower the quality of the fish. But if you bleed them right away while they still have a heartbeat, that really improves the quality. And then he freezes them in the round. And the nice thing about that is that a consumer has the opportunity to engage with breaking down a whole fish, and I think that there's a nice relationship that happens there with a person and their food when they have the opportunity to do that and to fully utilize a fish instead of receiving just a fillet or just a headed and gutted piece fish. There's just, you can make amazing stock if you have the head and the frame of the fish. And there's some parts that, like in perfect fillets, they're really beautiful, but they cut off oftentimes the best parts of the fish. They'll cut off the belly, which has a lot of rich oil in it, or the collar pieces under the gill plate. There's amazing rich meat there that most consumers never get to taste. So be looking for this opportunity, to purchase a whole salmon, and start building your relationship with wild salmon.
Thank you, Melanie. Chef Boden, so a gentleman here has asked, he's trying to be more sustainable with the food and staff, and he's just wondering, like, what methodologies are you using? Like, and does it require government subsidies, training of customer tastes? Like, what strategies are you using to have a sustainable business that supports local sustainable practices?
I mean, honestly, with what's going on right now, I can't answer any of those questions. No, seriously, we have conversations on a daily basis with chef friends all over the country. All of us have lots of ideas, and none of us know what the hell's going to happen. Forget about, next week, in 6 months. The fallout from all this is going to be affecting us for a long time, and I really don't know the answer. All I know is that us restaurant folk are scrappy as hell. We fight for what we need, and we make shit happen. I mean, that's, I don't know any of the answers. A combination of all those things, I'm sure, would help. Government assistance would definitely help. I personally am having an existential dilemma as far as what I do for a living and why the government should bother helping me, other than the fact that we support farmers and good working people, and provide a service for our community. But I'm honestly, I'm going back and forth every day on is the shack needed? Is destination restaurants, is that really need to be a thing anymore? I love cooking and I love what I do, but I don't know the answer to that. And that plays into how I feel about the government helping us or educating my community more about what we do, all of those things. I have no answers. I'm just trying to hold on as tightly as I can and keep on providing for my staff and my family and my community and make sure we get through it. And then I'll figure it out on the other end,
I appreciate that. I mean, that is an honest answer. I truly believe that, that restaurants, that chefs have a very important place, in that they connect so many different parts of the food system and also, generate the taste for things. And, David can speak to the culture. There is a culture of fine dining in America, yes, but
Absolutely. I don't disagree with any of that. It's so much bigger than that right now for me.
Right.
I was very lucky. I got to write an essay in the Washington Post a couple months ago, about what's happening and how restaurants are really part of our communities and how they do help put our communities out there, how they bring people together. Restaurants aren't just a place to eat, but they're a place to, revolutions start in restaurants. Social movements all started in restaurants. It's all, we're so embedded in the community.
Right.
But it's different from what some of us do on a daily basis. So it's trying to figure out how to wrap it back in. And honestly, that's a big catalyst for part of the reason we're opening Stand Grocery and making that market, so we can be more part of the community and we can do more for our community. Not that we don't already support our community, but in more meaningful ways instead of just financial.
Right. And so, David, to you, and so there's a question about the push-pull between monoculture status quo and the upside of biodiversity, but there's also a push-pull between the culture of fine dining and destination restaurants, and then there's also a long-standing, as to Ian's point, there's a long-standing history of the community space and the community dining space.
Right.
So if you could share some of your thoughts about both of these things. Do they run parallel? I mean, sure they do. I mean, money is a factor. Big money is a factor in both of these things. But, if you could talk about that, and kind of give us some perspective.
Right. Well, one of the things we have to think about in terms of fine dining was that historically it's always been located in cities. And cities historically also have been locales that do not have local food per se. They do not grow their own food. They depend upon the countryside outside to grow it. And so cities have always been this distorting dimension to food. And small town restaurants and gathering places, whether they're fish camps or the roadside barbecue joint or whatever, what you would call the community foodways of the people out in the state have always operated under a sort of different regime with different sources. And the question is, will the urban food system operate as it always has? Will local um, uh, uh, restaurants operate the way that they have. They source food differently. They have a different relationship with money and with their customer base. And I think it's something that we can't really predict with any great sense of certainty, but we should recognize the different games that those two worlds operate under, and what the stresses that the current pandemic is putting on them. City food is, I think, in much more peril. Even the grocery systems have been stressed to the maximum. I have a brother who lives in a high rise in Chicago, and he had his food delivered every day because he could afford to. And the food was delivered from all over the country.
Mm. Wow. Well, first of all, this has been truly amazing. I've learned so much here, and I actually want to continue this conversation and in various degrees with each and every one of you. But you've given us a lot of your time today. And so before we close, and thank you everyone for your questions. Before we close, I wanted to know if anybody wanted to share some closing remarks. So Germaine, I'll start with you.
Okay, well, yeah, this has been like a really good conversation, and I think a sobering conversation for folks who didn't understand the connection between agriculture and like the food systems, like, or the farm to table, like what that was. And I just like look at this time, and like as we're about to lead this session today about Black food justice pioneers, I think a lot about Fannie Lou Hamer and how her experiences with food apartheid, her challenges with it, like spurred her to create solutions. And my hope, especially like in the BIPOC farming community, is like the way that we survive uncertainty, I think, is through cooperative models. So, my hope is that we learn from some of the lessons that our African American and West African Gullah Geechee elders and ancestors provided for us, use those lessons to progress and survive in the future.
Thank you, Germaine. Melanie?
Thank you, first of all, Colleen, for hosting this. It really has been a stimulating conversation. I've really appreciated hearing everything that that all of you have to say. Ian, I really hope that you're able to get your restaurant open again. I myself am somebody who loves to cook, and I love to eat other people's good cooking. It's so wonderful when I can just sit down in a restaurant and be served amazing food. And to me, I almost look at it as art. It's an elevation of our souls to eat good food made with good ingredients. And I think that, we need to do what we can to maintain and bolster genetic diversity, biodiversity in watersheds and food sheds, and some places, all you have to do is just leave them alone. And they're incredibly productive. But unfortunately, as humans, we have this tendency to want to sort of have dominion over nature, and instead of just letting nature kind of take care of us, and somehow I just hope that we can reorient our thinking in a way that where we are not going to be losing amazing wild foods and diversity of agriculture, and I'm sure I could go on and on, but I want to let other people talk.
Thank you. Ian?
I just want to, I want to thank y'all for having me be a part of this. It was pretty cool and eye-opening and great to meet, even through a computer, new people, because we're all a little isolated right now. And Melanie, thank you for the sentiment about the restaurant. I mean, one of the advantages that we have, and that I guess it goes back to what David was saying earlier, is that we are in a small town and a small community, and that actually plays much better for us. And the likelihood of us making through this, to be honest, I'm very confident that we'll make through it. It's just a matter of how long. The things that play in our favor in this situation also are the same things that are a disadvantage. Where we're a destination restaurant, so the local community doesn't dine here as often, but we're in a small community, so our overhead and our expenses are much lower than they would be in a larger market. So we have that going for us. And just a little thing about David as well, he sent me some seeds for whippoorwill peas, which are an indigenous field pea to the Shenandoah Valley almost 7 years ago. And our first harvest, we had one farmer. I think our first harvest was about 2 pounds. And as of now, we have 4 farmers growing for us. And last year we harvested about 200 pounds. So it's really cool to see that whole chain and the work that David does and how it's affected other communities. There we go. I just made a big batch of whippoorwill miso, so I'll send you some, David. But yeah, it's cool to see how something a chance meeting at a food festival in Charleston 6 years ago turned into a lot of work, but profits for a lot of farmers that I work with and that I care a lot about. So it's really cool to see that whole chain, and then to reintroduce our region to these peas that people that grew up here have never tasted. So it's really kind of cool. So thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, David, closing remarks?
Well, I do want to say that I made a pilgrimage up to the shack so I could taste Ian's food, and it was splendid. A memorable dinner, and my brother and his family went with me, and we ate every dish on the menu. But food being a necessity engages everyone's attention, and more than that, it engages our imaginations. It's something that human beings think maybe more creatively about than anything for longer periods of time. So my hope is that the intelligence and imagination of those people who grow and who process food will enable us to make the adjustments necessary to push the best practices of both growing and preparation forward. And I will say that I think that large-scale institutions and entities are less flexible and less capable of change than people who are smaller scale, more nimble, and more capable of making decisions immediately. So for the small farmer, for the local restaurateur, this may be your moment.
Thank you. And so that is all the time we've had today. It's been an amazing conversation. Thank you, Melanie Brown, Jermaine Jenkins, Ian Boden, and David Shields. Just so everybody knows, about an hour after this broadcast ends, the recording becomes available to us and we'll be able to share it with you. I hope that you can continue further conversations about working in your local food systems. And if you have further questions, feel free to email impact@jamesbeard.org, and we can certainly direct them or find the answers for you. So I want to thank you all again for your time this afternoon, and I know that I've learned so much, and I look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hope to see you all for real someday.
Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yes.
Take care.
Be well.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.